Welcome back to week 8 of Peace Education. We're nearing the end now, so hope things are going well for everyone wherever you are in the world. This week we're going to talk about intersectionality, and hopefully by the end of the video it'll be really clear to you why this is so important in peace education. So we're thinking about how does the power and privilege of participants affect our learning and teaching processes, and how can we structure our processes to create more equity? So, you've seen from the readings that intersectionality is a concept that was introduced by Crenshaw. And basically, she was doing work in prisons and she realized that it wasn't enough just to talk about women's experiences in prison and even the difference between different races of women in prison, that social class was also a factor. So the intersection of these three identities, gender, race, and class, were all necessary to truly understand these women's experiences, okay? So intersectionality basically describes how our different identities combine to either give us or take away power and privilege in our lives, all right? So, from Crenshaw's work, we see that the people who are most often found in prisons are those that lack intersectional power, often due to race and class, right? And then, if you think about violence in the world, not only in the US, but the US is where we have the most data from, the people who are most often the victims of violent crime compared to their presence in society, so statistically speaking, it is female people of color, and particularly trans women of color are often the targets of these violent acts, okay? So their intersectional identities combined to give them less power and privilege, and then that leads to them unfortunately being the victims of abuse. And we can see this with Indigenous, when I say abuse, I'm talking about direct violence as well, and particularly murders and disappearances. And another example of this would be Indigenous women in Canada. So in our case, I want to do an activity just to help us think about what intersectionality means. In peace and conflict studies, we use the term fault lines to describe these different categories of identity. And fault lines sort of like the idea of an earthquake, right? Like a fault line can be fine. There can be no problems, but then if something happens to disrupt the situation, then we can end up with catastrophic events, right? So in this case, fault lines would include race, gender, religion, social class, language, sexuality, education, bodily capacities. And what I mean by that is, like, is a person differently abled? Do they have mental health issues, right? So what's going on physically with them? Then we can also think about other physical aspects such as attractiveness, right? People who fit into the stereotypical idea of what's attractive in a culture tend to have more power and privilege in those cultures, right? So we know that, for example, with kindergarten teachers, you can give the same assignment for grading and put the picture of two kids on it, one kid who's considered stereotypically cute and one kid who's considered stereotypically unattractive. And the cute kid, even though the work is exactly the same, will get a 10% higher grade. And that's already present in kindergarten, okay? And those kinds of privileges continue throughout the lives of people who are considered stereotypically attractive. There are a number of other categories that we could add, so you can think about what else you might like to add here. Family is one I've got on this, my flowers in Spanish, sorry about that. But family can refer to a couple things, and it depends on your context which one's more relevant. So family type, like nuclear family, tends to refer to a heterosexual couple, male and female, generally having two children, right? So it can be the type of family versus a single parent family, for example. Or in some countries it can actually mean like your last name. So for example, in Costa Rica there are 6 families who run the country. I mean, it's hard to say, but certainly you can see their significant influence in a number of different sectors, right? So politics, economics, they're always present. Okay. What other things can we think about? So we've got education level there. Someone had mentioned to me, and I think it's important, that social class and economic class might be different. So, for example, Donald Trump, when he goes bankrupt, even though in those cases, like, his economic class actually is quite low, he doesn't have a lot of money in that stage, his social class remains the same. So these two things don't necessarily need to be connected. In Latin America, we talk often about colorism, which is different than race, right? So that the color of your skin can influence how people treat you. So even though you might be from the same racial group, which might be mestizo, the lighter your skin is, the more likely you are to be treated well, okay? So these are just some examples of different identities that we can hold. And, I've done this activity with up to 20 different examples of fault lines. So there might be some that are more relevant in your community than are in others, right? So it might be tribe that you belong to. It might be ethnicity. It might be citizenship status, right? So are you documented or undocumented citizen? All right, all kinds of examples. So we're going to do an activity now, and I'm going to walk you through it step by step. So what I suggest is I'll explain the first step. You pause the video, do it on your own. Then second step, pause the video, and it's important that you go with the process, because if you try to get ahead of yourself, it tends to get confusing, and I've seen it get a little bit chaotic. So, all right, here we go. So your first task is to draw your flower, and it should have at least 6 petals, and each inner petal should line up with an outer petal, okay? So for me, what that looks like, I'm gonna do this one not as pretty as I normally do. All right, so there's my first step, okay? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 inner petals. And then outside each petal, I do a bigger petal, okay? So that's step 1. Inner petal, outer petal in line with each other. So pause the video and go ahead and do that. All right. Now, the second step is you need to think of a specific context. It's going to be a community that has to have a minimum of 10,000 members, and you must be a part of that community, okay? So you're not describing some other context that you don't know. It's your context. It might be a city, a region, or a country, all right, depending on what you want to analyze. So we're doing an intersectional analysis through this activity, okay? And then once you've focused on which community you want to analyze, okay, remembering that 10,000 people, you have to be a member of it, and it can be city, region, country, okay? So on the inner petal of your flower, I want you to think about which of the fault lines have the most influence, in your opinion, in that community. So I'm going to do Canada, and I'm going to put race, gender, age, education, language, and social class. Okay, so those are the categories that I think are the most important in the Canadian context, okay? So those are the fault lines that I'm going to analyze. All right, so go ahead and pause and do that part. Okay, so in step 3, what we're thinking about is within each of these fault lines, which group do I think, right, or do you think is the most powerful? So this is just your opinion, okay? And what I mean by that, if you're not sure, think about who are the politicians, who are in the media, and who control big corporations, all right? So in the Canadian context for race, I'm going to write white. For gender, I'm going to write masculine. For age, I'm going to say 50 plus. For education, I'm going to say professional. So when I say professional, that means like doctor, lawyer, some type of postgraduate degree. The language is English. social class is upper. All right. So those are, in my opinion, the most powerful groups within each of these categories. Okay, so that's step 3. Go ahead and do that and pause. All right, and finally in step 4, and this is the part that can be a bit tricky for people, if you consider yourself a member of the group that you've written down, then you color that petal in, okay? Maybe it might be a category where you don't feel completely a part of that category, okay? So, for example, I'm gonna color in white completely, all right? And I'm gonna say in education, like, yeah, because I'm a professor, right? So that's one of the professional degrees that are respected. I speak English as my first language, so I'm highlighting that. But then when it comes to social class, I don't come from the upper class, but now because of my professional position, I'm seen that way. So I'm gonna color that one in half, okay? So there's that, okay? So you go ahead and do step 4, you can pause, okay? And what you have at the end is a visual representation, a drawing of your opinion of your power and privilege intersectionally in your context, in your community, okay? So go ahead and pause and finish that up. All right, so coming back together, I want to talk a little bit about what this activity tells us. First of all, these are opinions, not facts, all right? You haven't done this activity based on the research, okay? So let's just keep that in mind, okay? This isn't science. Secondly, intersectional power and privilege can change over time. So when I was talking about, for example, social class, right? I was born into a working class family, and over time, through gaining education and experience, I've shifted in that category into possibly being seen as part of the upper class, all right? So that's changed. The other things that changed was context. So my intersectional power and privilege in Canada is actually not that great, but in Nicaragua, it's quite impressive, actually. And that's another example of how it changed over time, because in Nicaragua, when I was there the first time, and at that point I only had a master's degree, often in meetings where men and women were present, men would speak over women or interrupt them, and women generally weren't heard, and that included me. But when I went back with my PhD, then all of a sudden I was heard, I was listened to, and it was like almost like I was an honorary man, okay? So it changes with context and changes with time. I want to say that the cultural and structural imbalance that supports this intersectional power and privilege doesn't define us, okay? Just because, let's say, I had a teacher in LA who did this activity with me, and she was very angry afterwards, and she was like, how dare you say that I'm not powerful? Because she didn't have a single petal colored in at all. And my response to her was, first of all, of course you're powerful. Secondly, this is your opinion. I didn't say this, you did, okay? But it doesn't define us. It just tells us about the cultural and structural violence that exists around us in relation to these fault lines, all right? Obama's a perfect example of this. Black man, African father, single mother, and becomes president of the United States, right? So these categories don't define us, but they are realities that exist in our communities, okay? And the other thing that they do, and of course all of these things can be affected by upbringing, but they do tend to create a mindset, all right? If you are an intersectionally less privileged person, then you may have had the experience that when you enter into a store, people assume that you're stealing and they follow you around, right? Or they might not even let you into the store, depending on where you are in the world, okay? And so that can lead to a mindset of fear or suspicion, or the idea that people aren't on your side, right? And so the difference is that when you have a lot of intersectional power and privilege, it can lead to a mindset of confidence, because the assumption is that people have always been on your side, and so they're going to continue being on your side, right? When you walk into that store, you're welcomed, and people help you, and that tends to be your experience. In the same way that, attractive women talk about the aging process and how the point when they become invisible, and how they didn't realize how many benefits and privileges they got from being physically attractive, right? And so it's all implicit, it's all subconscious, this power and privilege, and most of us don't even realize that it's within us or why it's within us, okay? But this has real consequences when it comes to teaching, because when we're thinking about who speaks and when, generally in a workshop or a class, the people with the most intersectional power and privilege in the space will be the ones who speak first, and often for the longest amount of time, all right? Those are people who are used to being heard and valued, right? And people with less intersectional power and privilege are often the quietest in the room, okay? So then it also affects people who advocate for themselves, right? Students with less intersectional power and privilege will receive a grade and accept the grade. Students with more power and privilege are often more willing to advocate for themselves and come and question, why did I get this grade? This doesn't seem right to me. And often, people have made mistakes in grading. I am a person, when I was in undergrad and university, that I felt quite confident going to professors, and it was due in part to intersectional power and saying, like, this doesn't make sense to me. I thought that this was the answer, and I actually found out that one exam had been graded wrong on 4 different questions, and I ended up, by advocating for myself, helping another 200 people that were in my class. But that was because I had the confidence to do that, and I was the only one that did it, right? So that says something about how I enter the world with confidence, okay? And that advantage, that confidence for me, came from a background of parenting, actually. So not as much the intersectional power and privilege, but being told that, like, you have to advocate for yourself, you have to stick up for yourself, no one's going to do that for you, right? So there's all kinds of factors that affect these things, but it is often in relation to these fault line factors, okay? So then for us as facilitators of teaching and learning practices, we have to think about how can we help with equity, and how can we help people recognize their own privilege within the space and create room for everyone's voices and for everyone to be heard, all right? So an example of that is that if a number of students have raised their hand to speak, I will always pick the person who has spoken the least in the group to speak first. I also try to do activities where each person in the class gets to share, and that's specifically so that people who don't generally speak have the opportunity. And they can pass if they want to, that's a big part of it, but it's still there, okay? And it also has effect when people are doing group work, and helping people to be aware of their own power helps to create more equity in group work, because it's often the people with more intersectional power and privilege that are also the ones that lead the group. So they decide what the topic will be, they decide how it's all going to play out. And sometimes that's not the best strategy for the group, but the group defers. So by helping students be aware, or people in workshops to be aware of these different dynamics, we can shift into a practice of more equitable communication, okay? So this is also about creating a variety of methods and spaces for people to contribute. So not only in the large group, but also in doing small group work, pair group work, right? The reason that we include that pass option is that we try generally in peace pedagogy not to volunteer others. So I generally don't ask students to speak if they haven't raised their hand. even when we're having open discussion, the way that I do it in my classes is that the person who spoke last is the person who chooses who speaks next. So I'm not in control all the time of who's speaking. And in the situations where someone hasn't spoken, like the only time I'll call on them is if I see them kind of like make a face or like start to raise their hand and then draw back. And then I'll say like, so-and-so, did you have something to say? But otherwise, generally trying not to volunteer others is part of peace pedagogy. Acknowledging power and privilege whenever possible and making it visible. Okay, so this is intersectionality is like a lens that you put on and you see the world through it, and then helping students by giving them examples of where you can see it is really helpful. So I do this a lot with textbooks, right? Who's represented in textbooks? What roles do they play in textbooks? Why are they there? Who's not there, right? And why aren't they there? So traditionally, in most contexts, you'll see in textbooks that people with the most intersectional power and privilege are the ones that are represented on the page, and those with less are non-existent. So when I was a kid, for example, we didn't have people with different abilities or different capacities depicted in pictures in our textbooks. That's changed a lot in Canada, but that's a recent thing, and it's a great thing that it has changed, okay? Another thing is to engage and embrace silence. So when I ask a question, I'm happy to sit in silence for 20 seconds, 30 seconds, as long as it takes for someone to be ready to speak up. It's true that people are generally uncomfortable with silence, but some people need more time to formulate their thoughts, and that's okay. And that's another thing that I do is if I'm going to have a group discussion, I often give like 2 minutes to think about and write down like what you think about the topic, and then we discuss it. So it's giving people with English as a second language more time to prepare, because often if we go directly into discussion, then it's too quick, and some students will feel uncomfortable breaking into that discussion to share when they haven't had time to think it through. Okay. And then finally, in this, what we're thinking about is always who benefits, right? Who benefits from the status quo in education? Who benefits from textbook sales? Who benefits from corporate sponsorship of schools, right? And all of those questions are about often intersectionality, okay? So this is something that I want you to keep in mind when you're planning your teaching and learning plans. And so that's what we're going to look at next week, right? So how do we monitor and evaluate peace education programs, and what strategies can we use to measure indicators? And remember that we're using your teaching and learning plans as the basis of that work, all right? So please post those by the date, and I look forward to reading them and seeing how you've accounted for intersectionality in your work. Okay, take care until then.